Okay, so let's get started with creating our first landscape then. So we're just going to use the environment that we were using earlier. So I'm going to load up the level that we made. So content draw, my stuff, levels, level 1. Just need to save that. There we go. So we're going to be creating our landscape inside this level with our Lumin global illumination lighting system that we created earlier. So first things first, we need to go into landscape mode, which you can do through the selection mode here. Click on landscape and you'll notice we get this nice big grid. So the way to figure out the scale of your environment is using the resolution. So the overall resolution here, that's in meters. Now it has its own sort of size chart system, which I will put on the screen now. And the way that this works is that you can see the resolution there. Those are the different size resolutions. You can have different sized landscapes as well. And when we talk about height maps and using height maps, we'll need to be using this resolution for the height maps as well. Okay. So coming back to the environment, we're not going to add on a material to begin with. We're going to do that later. But if you click Enable Edit Layers, this allows us to change the strength of the height maps and things that we might add on later. We're just going to keep the location, scale, and rotation the same. And to begin with, we're going to create something which is 500 meters roughly as a square. So we're just going to keep it with the original 63 by 63 quads by 1 by 1 sections. Okay, and we're going to click Create. So now that we have our landscape, you can see that we have this big flat plane. So if I just go back into selection mode to change my lighting a little bit, there we go. Just going to give myself a little bit of a brighter situation. There we go. So nice flat plane here. And the way we can sculpt on this landscape, you've got to think of this like a mesh, is using the sculpt tools. So these brushes work similar to any other brush that you might find in Photoshop, Illustrator, that sort of thing. So you've got the size of the brush, which obviously you can change using the square brackets on your keyboard, and it's not limited to the scale. Unreal has a lot of sort of sliders in it, but these aren't absolute sliders. So if I wanted to set this to like 100,000, it does have a maximum of about 65,000. But if you want to increase that, you just got to type in that number. But if not, you can just stick to the 8,192 values that you can have on the slider. Brush fall off is sort of the featheredness of your brush. So you can have a complete circle brush, or you can have a feathered brush. And then tool strength obviously is the amount that's going to increase or decrease the size of your brush. So the sculpt brush allows us to sort of layer on these extra layers of sort of environment. It allows us to sort of inflate or sculpt. If you press Shift and click, it will subtract as well. Okay, so that's how you can create your sculpt. Now there are different types of sculpting system, sort of sculpting brushes to do with the types of fall off. So if I was to just make my brush really harsh, the default brush sort of makes this just sort of, it raises it up, and if I was just feather it very slightly, it sort of raises up to this flat point with a curved edge. Now you could have it so that if you change the brush fall off to be sharp, then it makes really sharp edges. Equally, you can have it so that it creates like a dome shape brush point, or you can have sort of the opposite where it sort of makes this pinched in version as well. Okay, so there's different types of sort of the shape of the brush fall off. You can have it so it's sort of pinched, a bulge, or a sort of curved or sharp edge. Those are the different types of sculpt brush. Now erase works the similar way to the sort of minus brush, but it just basically removes the data back to where it was to begin with. So nothing changes there. It sort of works like a flattened brush, but it just erases it back to the default value. So it's similar to the flattened brush, where you can just sort of flatten everything. However, the flatten brush will work to whatever height the center is. So you saw there, I laid over that sort of mound point, and then I can flatten to that. So that allows you to flatten the brush, flatten the land, sorry. Smooth's quite a useful tool. So if you get one of these harsh edges and you're trying to incorporate it into a more realistic landscape, you can just go across with the smooth brush and it smooths everything over. Now the ramp brush can be a little bit tricky to use. I don't tend to use it very often. So what this actually does is you can place 2 points by clicking and then increase or decrease the height of the ramp itself. And then you can change the width of the ramp and also the fall off of it, so it will blend into the landscape. And then you click add ramp, and then surprise, surprise, it creates like a ramp shape. So if that's a way you can create slopes on your landscape if you want to do that. And then you just click reset, and then you can click again and create your ramp once again. Okay, I don't particularly like the ramp tool. I didn't use it very much. Then have the erosion brush. So there's two types of erosion brush. You have erosion and hydro erosion. So the way the erosion brush is, it tries to sort of simulate the effect of a landslide. So you can see here, if I sort of go across it, if you imagine this is a mountain, if I make the fall off a bit sort of more feathered, you can go through and you can actually create these sort of landslide, landfall effects. You can see here it's sort of cutting in a line along where it would erode away due to a landfall. You can then also change the sort of the thickness and the effects of sort of the strength and iterations of the erosion itself, and that's one way that you can create sort of those realistic looking mountains. You then have your hydro erosion, and this tries to simulate the effects of water. So water erodes in a slightly different way than a landslide would. So you can see here that as I sort of work along, it cuts in as if a river had sort of cut into the mountain there. The lighting is a little bit off. There we go. So you can see it sort of cuts in through that gap there to try and create that sense of erosion. Another way you can create your realistic looking landscapes. Noise brush is quite useful if you want to create some variation in the ground. Now, if you make your brush really, really big, you can actually create these really funky sort of automatic cliffs, that sort of thing. So this is a great place to start if you just want to like make the tool strength really low and make your brush really big. You can actually just tap through, and automatically you're not starting with a flat surface, you're starting off with a sort of bumpy surface, which you can then use as a beginning to then start adding in erosion or sculpting particular landscapes, that sort of thing. Okay. We're not going to work with a retopology just because we don't need to really focus on that at the moment, but that is something you can do once you're happy with your environment. So I'm just going to erase everything to be the original. Okay. And I'll show you something else. So that is the sort of inbuilt tools to sculpt a landscape within Unreal. Something that I think is much easier to use is the alpha brushes. So alpha brushes are textures that you can load up into a brush, and then it changes the shape of your brush. So you can see on the brush type, we have a circle which can be feathered, but under alpha brushes, you can see at the moment it's not got a pattern, but it has put the default pattern, which is the black and white checked cubes. So the way this works is white is where it will add land. So if I was to actually click here, it creates the sort of white spacing is where it is. And that's, I know that's a bit confusing because on the brush, the dark spaces are actually the white in the brush, if that makes sense. So you have to imagine that it's now in the orientation that the image is. Okay, so it adds in those points. So obviously it's using the default texture, which is the checked pattern, but you can load up some brushes, either the ones that you've created or ones that you've downloaded. So really easy to create an alpha brush, and I might do a video on how to do that later on. But for today, I'm just going to use one that I've already got, which is from the Brushify pack by Joe Garth, I think his name is. It's a really, really good pack. This one cost about £40, but he has like 100 packs which vary in costs as well. So once you've got your alpha brush, you just drag and drop that into the texture, and then it might think about it for a minute, and then you can see we've loaded up our brush. Now, the way these alpha brushes work from this pack is they are split up onto the red, green, and blue channels of the texture, because an alpha brush only needs to be grayscale, and each channel is a grayscale. So when you combine them together, you can actually have 3 brushes in one image using red, green, and blue. So under the texture channel, you can actually change red, green, and blue, and sometimes you also get ones with alpha, so you can have 4 channels in there as well, which is pretty cool. And what this means is when we increase the size of our brush, you might see that I no longer have this sort of circle brush. I have something which looks like a mountain. So if I make the brush really big again, need an extra 0, and then just start to place these mountains, you start to get these naturally formed mountains with sort of the lines of erosion on as well, which is a really, really useful way to sort of quickly create a realistic looking landscape. So I'm just going to undo that, because I'll show you the other brushes, and then go to the green brush and just decrease the size of it very slightly, and strength as well. There we go. So we can then start to create these sort of cool looking mountain ranges in the style of a realistic mountain, because it has all those natural erosion lines. So you might also be able to tell, it's probably easier to tell with the default brush, but the brush sort of rotates automatically, and this is to add variation, so that you're not creating a really set pattern. And you can turn that off using auto rotate. It's up to you, but this is then also going to only produce the pattern in that one direction. So sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. It depends on what you are trying to create. So generally it's on by default. So just if you want to create really set patterns, then you need to turn that off. Okay. And you can load up pretty much any black and white texture into there, any shape. So if you have custom brushes that you want to use, like a square brush, or like a star-shaped brush, or even your own custom alpha brushes of mountains or sand dunes, rivers, that sort of thing, then you just drag and drop those. It needs to be in your content drawer to begin with, so I'd probably make a folder called alpha brushes, and then just keep all your brushes in one place, and then you can drag and drop those into your texture. Now the way you've got to think of these brushes is they work similar to height maps or displacement maps. You just drag and drop those in, and then they're adding on those extra layers. Okay, so to sculpt your landscape really quickly, use alpha brushes, or just have a go at using the sculpt tools using the ones that are already in by default. Now you can actually use the smooth brush with an alpha brush as well. All of these brushes that I previously mentioned, like the sculpt, smooth, flatten, all of that, you can actually do those with alpha brushes, and it gives some interesting looks. So it's worth playing around with that for a few minutes just to figure out what's going on. So I'm actually going to just decrease the alpha of my entire landscape, which means it's just going to decrease the height overall of everything, because the landscape that I'm going to create for this tutorial is actually quite flat. It has mountains in the background, but we could add those in as 3D models. So I only need a little bit of noise for what we're going to try and create.